You are listening to Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. I'm your host, Josh Lucas, and at Method, our vision is to connect technology with humanity for a simpler digital future. Join us as we speak with leading experts to discuss industry trends, best practices, and emerging technology that can help you and your organization craft better digital products and experiences. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. And this is part 2 of a broader conversation we're having on modern products. So if you have not checked out the first episode, I would highly recommend that you go back, listen to that before this. We are getting into modern product, and this is, Jason, keep me honest here. This is a framework that you've been working to put together that encompasses a lot of what we're seeing out with the clients that we're working with. A lot of these things are not new in and of themselves, but what you're doing is trying to connect the dots between a lot of these pillars that we're discussing with strategy, discovery, delivery, culture, and empowerment. And so that's what this conversation is about. And we're going to be focusing today on the delivery and the culture piece of the conversation. So again, please go back, listen to the first half if you haven't. And just to recap the gentleman we're sitting here with, we're here with Jason Rome, who is our head of solutions here at Method. And I'm going to make sure I don't mess this up here, David, but we're David Brown, who is the Director of Digital Product Operations at EDF Renewables North America. And so thank you both for being here. And let's just jump right in. Folks who have listened to the first part, they're eager, I'm sure, to hear the rest of the story. And so we're going to be jumping into delivery. So take it away, Jason.
With delivery, and whether you want to call it the product development lifecycle or software development lifecycle, generally we look at the phases of strategy and prioritization, analysis and requirements gathering, development, testing, release management, and then operations of that end to end. And specifically, when we're doing an assessment, and the outcomes we're looking for are the impact. So, does what you build accomplish the goals that you set out to do? Performance, do you build with quality? And so, can you meet the SLAs that are expected? Uptime, the performance, is it running efficiently? I think especially now with a lot of folks focus on sustainability, making sure you're being conscious around like the efficiency with which you're using cloud and resources, et cetera. And then the efficiency in which you build. And so, is work flowing through the system in an efficient way? Teams aren't getting blocked. Teams aren't getting bottlenecked. And actually, David, that's kind of where I want to start. Bottlenecks. When you think about delivery organizations where you've worked, where's your most likely suspects for work getting bottlenecked when it comes to driving impact and performance?
When we think about bottlenecks, first thing I would want to consider is bottlenecks working against us or are they working for us? And so bottlenecks don't have to be a thing that are pushed on you, but you can design them into the organization. And so the first thing is map out your value streams or your processes, and then identify what hindrance is that bottleneck bringing. Sometimes the bottleneck is bringing inefficiencies, and sometimes the bottlenecks are bringing either bad decisions or causing the effectiveness of what you're trying to deliver. And you have to make the trade-off decisions of where you're going to move those. More recently, in my experience, we intentionally were putting bottlenecks for shift left mentality, shift everything left. We were wanting to shift a lot of our bottlenecks up front so that we can control the flow associated to what we were focused on. And so that's what we effectively were trying to buy. We were trying to buy focused delivery. And so we put more governance up front to say, all right, we can't let the good idea fairy always break through and distract us. And so I guess that's my way of framing it is when you find them, there's a lot of intentionality associated to what do we do with what we have? And we know we can't move them all at the same time, nor we should. So if we want to measure ourselves and measure the decisions we make, what are we going to move with first? What's our riskiest bottleneck today?
I like that a lot. And I've talked to a lot of leaders about their role in delivery. And one of the things I like to say is, one of the leaders' jobs is to prevent teams from starting too much work before they've finished. And I think that's one of the things that kills a lot of teams is you have so much work in progress, work in flight, And when it comes time to release or roll out product, there's so much training and it's so like disparate, and you've moved so many things at once, or you're partially finished with things. And so I think, as leaders look at their organization and what they're attempting to do, focusing attention a little bit more on finishing before you start new things, and finishing meaning not just we released it, but it worked, being a really key thing. And so, I like what you're saying there of like bottlenecks can work in your favor. And I think leadership creates that discipline a lot for their teams and also protects them. That's why, one of the things I like to think about is, are teams pulling work forward when they're ready, or is someone pushing work on them? And I think historically, a lot of times leadership was creating an environment where they kept pushing and pushing and pushing more work on a team. It's like, oh, you've got capacity in your sprint, take on a new feature, not spend time refactoring or like doing discovery. And so I think looking at your role as leadership of like making sure things are ready to be pulled forward, and then and encouraging teams to pull that work forward when they have the capacity, is a different way of thinking about work, of like how it flows through the system. It's just a subtle mental shift of letting teams, come and get it versus saying like, hey, when is this going to be done? Because it just creates those conflicts. And, cognitive load is something I think is really important culturally. And it's hard for teams to multitask and constantly context switch. And it just causes this massive drop in efficiency if the product and development team is constantly having to like switch places in the code base and work on new features and work on a lot. And it creates just a drain on people. So, yeah, I like that bottlenecks can be a good thing. One other thing that we've talked about recently, David, is, and you use this term in part one, is coordination and complex coordination. And I think it's interesting to see a lot of clients are working on modernization right now. They've got a lot of sprawl, or they've gone through M&A, or they've built certain things they want to replace with platforms, or they have things that aren't connected. And so, David, you've talked a lot about this in a couple of directions. I want to take this, but one thing you said to me that's been really impactful is, agile teams are really good at adding stuff to their product, not taking stuff back out of the product. How are you guys like working that in? Like, how are you getting teams to think differently about like, because I feel like when it's time to retire something, people like it's a sunset of a whole system, not like a sunset of a couple features. So I don't know. I'd be curious what you guys are seeing there.
So this is something that I haven't solved or figure out like what is the right thing all the time.
We're going to do it today.
Yeah,
We've got 20 minutes left. We're going to solve it.
Beautiful. But it is the awareness to, mainly in the product management space, that you own the entire ecosystem. You don't only own the things that are on the roadmap, but you own the full experience. We talk about measurement a lot. And I think because we stop measuring too soon most of the time, the product management side of the organization isn't thinking about how to lean their product back out to make it more enjoyable or more a better experience for their user base. So let's put those things into the roadmap, and we might see them occur more often. It's okay to have a goal that, hey, we identified something in our feature set that isn't being used, or it actually doesn't bring a balance to our product that we're offering. And so we want to draw it down, but we can't just cut it off. We have to disconnect it the appropriate way, identify like what are the source systems of the information, who's feeding it, who's using it today. And so it takes care and feeding of it. And it's the same thing we do naturally. You have, if you care about, botany, like you have to prune back the bush in order for it to be a healthier environment.
I like that a lot. And it, it's similar to like tech debt. And a lot of teams I find don't have a shared vernacular of like talking about like what tech debt means to them. It's a very umbrella use term. You and I've talked about this before, but whatever prioritization framework you use, things like tech debt or UX quality of life or adopting a new design system or removing a feature for the product, none of those frameworks raise that type of thing to the top. Like it's never, they are always looking for new business value versus this kind of quality of life, maintainability of the product. And so I think that's one of the inherent weaknesses of some of the ways we do prioritization. We think about product. It is a very add new features, this kind of like feature race. But I think what we're seeing now in a lot of cases, especially as we prepare for AI and new emerging technologies, is so many of our products have become so complex over time. They've become so kind of burdened with feature bloat that it's impeding people from getting work done. And so being able to look at that experience holistically, again, kind of step back from it strategically and say like, okay, we probably need to thin this out. We need to do this, but a lot of teams don't get to spend the time thinking about that because how they're measured, how they're incented is what new thing have you done, not is the product doing its job.
Well, how much of that, the I don't want to say inability, but how much of the unwillingness to trim back on features or functions within within the product, how much of that do you think is influenced by the perceived blowback um, from the end user? Like, well, they've gotten used to, they built habits around these features, and now we're going to just take it away. But there's still a lot of people potentially using that, and we don't want to disrupt that. And that, how often do you think that is a primary influence versus just like more is always better mentality?
I talk about the word preference a lot, and there's two types of preference. There's capital P preference and lowercase p preference. And so we see this a lot with, if we're trying to drive digital adoption instead of people going into like a branch or a store or using the call center of like, well, if we get rid of that, there's a lot of people that prefer that channel. And people's true preferences are what's going to be the lowest cost on my time? What is the most efficient way to do things? What has the best ROI for me? Those are like people's real preferences, whether they're employees or customers. And so I think if you look at the feature too closely versus the problem, you can end up a little bit blind to that process. And listen, anything's going to take change management. There's this concept called the rule of 9x in product, which is people overvalue what they have by 3 times and they undervalue new things by 3 times. So unless it's 9 times better, someone's going to not be happy when you move the cheese on them. But like, if you go in there and communicate like, we did this because it's going to save you time. And because we listened to you and your voice or your voice of your peers was part of this, like a lot of companies, when they do a release, it's like, look at this great thing we did, not look at this great thing you asked us for. And it doesn't and they use feature focused language versus outcome focused language of what it's going to do for somebody. Users are very resilient. They're very smart. Like they're going to adapt new things, and you just got to, you can UX your way through a lot of that stuff. You can change manage your way through a lot of that stuff. There's great tools out there now for like, adding coach marks or coaching someone through a new experience. So I think it's a fear, it's a resistance, and it probably, we have to go back to the last episode, but it's probably like a lack of good discovery happening in some of these cases. So I don't know. I'd be curious your thoughts, David.
No, I think you said it beautifully. I don't know if I could add anything more to that. To be honest with you, I think everything you called out is probably the symptoms of why we're not seeing it often today. But kind of to your point, we can troubleshoot that. We just have to be very intentional of how we want to address it. The one thing that because I work often more with enterprise tools than anything else. And so it doesn't match up really well to B2B, B2C offerings out there. And what I really do not like to see is we use sunsetting as an approach to push adoption to something else. And that's just kind of lifting the rug out underneath the user to say, hey, you no longer have this as an option, and your compliance date is within 30 days, you use this new path. And that's a really bad way to go about it. And so to your point, if you shift this forward and say, hey, how do we want to change their experience? And we just need to go sit with them and say, like, what are you doing? Often they don't want to punch 20 buttons to get their job done. And so consolidating the feature sets and the tools that we're giving them, they want that anyways. They just don't know to ask for that.
I love that story. And there's like an interaction design component of it. And it's funny, one of the things that I love building product for salespeople, because they're the most honest people in the world when it comes to product adoption. Like on your operational employees, like back office, like you can pull the rug out from under them and like force them to use a new tool. If you give a salesperson a bad tool that they don't feel like is helping them do their job, like yellow notepad, post-it notes, texting people, here I come. Like I am not going to use it because it's like the most honest group of people of like, nope, this doesn't help me do my job. Sorry, like try again later. I'm not going to adopt this type of thing. And so yeah, that pulling the rug out is important, and we could probably do a whole nother podcast on the importance of change management, which I think is one of the forgotten heroes of digital transformation. And you know, change management is something that starts during discovery. I think a lot of people attach it to the release of a product versus understanding those issues. But as long as you speak someone's language and like nail what they're trying to accomplish and like walk them through it, it can be a lot less intimidating. But I think it goes back to like, when you talk about enterprise tools, releasing every 2 weeks is not an advantage with some of these tools, because like you're changing how a large group of people do their job. And so I think that's one of the things that like sometimes organizations, they measure the frequency of their releases as a thing of success versus the actual success of their releases. And it's not a one size fits all approach of saying like, I see this sometimes. Organizations are like, we want to release more frequently. Say, well, why? Like, is that creating an advantage for you at all? And especially in the space you work in, we're doing a lot of work in the industrial space now. Releasing too frequently can create a disadvantage because the change management, the training, you're constantly moving things. I worked with one client, financial services space, and we went out and talked to their users, and they're like, listen, I love what the technology team is doing, but man, I miss an email from you guys and I can't do my job the next day.
Yeah.
Because there's just so much new stuff all the time, and I'm getting lost all the time. So, I'm not sure how we got here, but I'm glad we did.
Yeah.
No, I have a question around that of like, and maybe this does or doesn't make it into the final edit, but when you're seeing in that specific use case, right, and you're saying, hey, like I missed something and now I can't do my job. How often are we overvaluing the new features? Like we're talking about like, maybe we need to trim back on old features, but how are there moments where we overvalue? Like, yes, we know that there's a reason for this and our discovery has told us this is necessary, but is it, and then maybe this goes back to the releasing that you're talking about here, to the release schedule or the versioning, but do we sometimes overvalue how quickly it must be adopted? Is that ever a negative?
I'd be curious your thoughts first.
I think we always do it. So you asked when, and the answer is always again. And the reason being is when we do discovery, it isn't a activity or set of activities to tell us, all right, we thought something before and now we know it's true. It isn't to prove something out. Nothing's ever proven until you put it into production in someone's hands and you see how they interact with it. And so when we get to the point inside of our teams that we stop looking at our stories and our epics as a hypothesis of what we think to be true, and we just know that the moment we put it out in the world, it's we have instant reward from it. That's when we've fallen into that fallacy. And so there needs to be this healthy humbling to say, no, these are our bets that we're making along the way. And bringing it back to your last point, if we're tagging those bets to say how impactful are they to the user and how the user does their job, and we bring the right sort of cadence to that, that gives us more optionality to maybe the next release we are releasing, but the user doesn't see the benefit of it. That's okay, because now we have a delivery cadence that's working for internal operations, and we are tempoing our delivery to our user base in a way in which they can manage the amount of change and they're not over fatigued as well. Those are optionalities that should occur.
The two things there, because it happens both on the kind of employee side as well as the consumer side, is it goes back to like really knowing the problem space well. But I find as teams work more and more, they distance themselves from the reality of the employee or the customer's environment and their journey, and they start building what they would want and how. I see a lot of organizations build the technology of how they want their team to work versus the realities of it. Especially during COVID, the people who build technology, we sit in front of a computer all day. We're in a chair. It's a quiet environment. We have our big screens, but like going out into a hospital, a pharmacy, a warehouse, and like understanding like the technology is not the hero of those employees' day. They're interacting with another person. They're picking up products off the shelf and handing it to people. Maybe they're not using a mouse like we would use it. Like we get so caught up in how we wish to run we could run our business versus like the realities of how people use these tools to get their jobs done. And on the consumer side too, when we're building consumer products, when people build journey maps and look at it, step one of the journey is usually step one of their product, not where the customer started their journey, which is usually Google. Or like a need. But like, I think thinking the technology is the hero when it's the sidekick. And so I like to ask organizations like, hey, how much of your employees or users' time do they spend working for the technology versus how much time does the technology spend working for them?
Yeah.
And you can do it really well, especially if you're trying to scale an operation where you can embed kind of your company's culture and DNA of how you hope employees and users will interact things in a product in like a really elegant way. But if it's not done elegantly, people question the value of what they're getting from the technology because they're spending so much time feeding it versus getting value out, especially in this, era of data and AI where meaningful data collection from employees, users, whoever it is really important. But if you don't have a clear value exchange for how that data is helping somebody, they're going to immediately push back on it. And so like understanding that at a real deep level helps product development, product design so much.
What makes me think of when you're talking about it doesn't need to be the hero, it needs to be the sidekick. Oftentimes it's like in the production world, it's kind of like you are doing a great job if people don't know you're there. And that's kind of what I'm hearing here is like when we're making the product fit the end user the right way, it's a seamless thing. Like they can go through their day start to finish and it's become a asset, a tool that they're leveraging regularly, but it's not something that they have to sit down and like really focus all their time and attention in this because that's pulling them away from what they're trying to do ultimately.
No, I mean, I say this a lot. Most great experiences are very forgettable.
Yeah.
And the example I always use, and it's funny because I was just with a client and he told me a story like this and it backed up this because I've been saying it for a while. I say, if I ask you to remember an Uber ride, is it a good ride? Like if you can recall an Uber ride, are you going to tell me a good story? And I had a client, he's only been on 2 Uber rides and he told me the story and it was horrible. and so, like I always, sometimes we'll get into like fix, hey, can you map the login journey for user? I was like, well, if login feels like a journey, it like we've gone wrong. Like there is no such thing as a delightful like password reset. Like it is something you want to like seamlessly like just happen. And so, a lot of there is a, not everything needs to be like super delightful and super memorable. Like those need to be inserted at moments where there's like a clear ROI on being able to do that. And like most things people are looking for digital, it's a companion to what they're trying to do. So I think we ended up in a really good place here, which is this world of like interaction design, change management, communications, which I think is a real forgotten hero of our work because it's not the fun stuff. It's not the trendy stuff. It's just a muscle you need to develop. Getting back to delivery, and I think intersecting it with culture a little bit. I think one of the things we look at for culture in the delivery lifecycle is patterns of collaboration as a way of measuring culture. And I think you and I have very different experiences here because for me, when I'm meeting a client, I have to assess how their culture impacts our ability to get work done and how our work intersects with their culture and their team structure. And for you, you're looking at, hey, are the seeds of an excellent culture there where I can kind of come in and make an impact? So we have very different lived experiences here. I wanted to get your thoughts on patterns of collaboration. And I always think about collaboration within a functional team, collaboration between teams, and collaboration between digital and the rest of the organization, which I think is what we actually started hitting on a little bit because we're talking about digital and operations and employee experience and like marketing, that type of thing. So I'm curious, from a culture and a delivery standpoint, patterns of collaboration and like what you're seeing and like what you look for and how you or how you think about culture as well.
Yeah. The first part, I think, is how well does the organization network with itself? And so, how easy is it to cross lines? Are certain levels of leader in the organization, when they see that someone needs an answer, are they willing to say, hey, here's a name? And do they need to make an introduction, or can that person just go out and reach to that person too? I think another aspect of organizational culture that is in when we talk about culture, it's what are the things that we're actively incentivizing and then de-incentivizing as well. And so are people wanting to say an answer when they don't know the actual answer? Or is the organization at a large okay with saying, hey, I don't know, actually the specialist of that is over here. I think these are all elements of what I'm looking for to say, how much change can we really influence in this place? And how easy will that change be along the way?
Yeah. I like that point about networking. And it makes me think about, you know, everyone in the organization, and this kind of gets to a little bit of org structure and team topologies, understanding the role they play and how they support value creation. And so you see this a lot of companies, they're trying to, build out better insights and a data lake, or they're building a platform layer and they're trying to centralize APIs. And sometimes what I've seen is those efforts become their own hero. And so then they've built the thing and then they're going out to advocate for teams to adopt it. Versus in an organization like, hey, those teams support value creation of other product teams, and having that relationship and having that strong working relationship with them is really important. So I think, yeah, that networking of, okay, hey, I need access to an environment, do I know who the cloud and DevOps team is? And are they going to say, well, we can't get to that until next quarter because we have our own modernization roadmap, or all these roadmaps of all these teams kind of aligned to each other? And so I think that's probably one of the things, going back, we talked about silos, that hurts a lot, is you have different teams with different visions that aren't syncing to cross organizational wins that they all win together. And I think that's, people see their own releases sometimes as their wins, but I always ask, like, hey, what's our win as an organization? What are we going to point to? Like, what unifies and like rallies all of us? That's not just like hitting a milestone on a roadmap, like a measurable event, something that we can celebrate together, that brings the team together. And so looking at that collaboration across teams, like, does that exist? Or are they constantly like negotiating against each other's scope because there's not like a clear enterprise set of priorities type thing?
How do you tackle that? Like when you're working with a client, or if you are the organization where like, I don't know if even calling it siloed is the right term in this specific situation, but there's a number of reasons why people might be operating against one another unknowing.
Yep.
How do you break them out of that? Like, what are the actionable steps to fight that?
I think I'll start off with saying, you mentioned team topologies, and one thing that I like about it is it does a really good job of saying different team types and what is the part that they play. And I relate this to understanding that your product is maybe a dual market model, to where we'll go back to Uber. You have to have Uber riders and drivers, and so you have to appeal to both. When we have teams that their job is to provide a service for another team, we need to make sure that they're not measuring success by the amount of things that they put out that make other teams dependent on them. And so really, maybe even looping it back to removing things is providing those services. So those teams that should be incentivized to enabling other teams, how do they measure that? And they should be measuring it because that other team that we're supporting, their, if you want to say their velocity went up or their impact was greater or anything else, and that's because what we were able to do for them, because we either synchronized with their cadence or we delivered them something that they were able to use. But what you don't do is incentivize that enabling team by, what was your velocity? How many things did you deliver? How often is the company coming to you with requests like that? And so when you look at kind of the value proposition for each team, and if they are enabling other teams, you measure them completely differently. They measure themselves completely differently. The awareness of that is a huge mental shift that I think is very hard to turn for large scale organizations.
I know you had to spend a lot of time on that because, a lot of your initiatives all have the same dependencies on your ERP. And so helping those teams figure out, like, what are we pursuing on our own versus where are we enabling other teams, and like balancing that roadmap can be a really hard thing. I mean, a lot of times you do see, organization and where it does feel like a 6-year-old soccer game where it's like swarm ball. And so, everybody has to be on every meeting versus like people being able to play positions. And it's funny because you talk to different people, and we've talked about shifting left a lot. And, the two things you hear at every organization is, I'm not being included enough and there are too many meetings. And so I think it's developing the sense of like organizational trust and flow of like just the right involvement, using creating visibility of work and work in progress and everyone better documentation management, knowledge management throughout the organization. So people can comfortably kind of play those positions, play those roles, and like understand those relationships. And we went back to talking about like the hero versus the sidekick, having a good sense of like, what are those moments of truth? Like which products play like a hero role in the user or the employee experience versus which are kind of a supporting layer to that. Um, and it's funny now because like we're seeing several types of projects that are, hey, can you help me build a single pane of glass that sits on top of these 8 or 10 tools and like connects the experience into a single dashboard because our people have to like bop around so much. And we are seeing this kind of wave of like hub and spoke type projects of like we have such a sprawled ecosystem and each one of these products has considered themselves their own hero when they each actually play a very particular role in the journey, but there's no unified view of it. And it's not the most impossible thing to do. Like if you just sit down and like map your ecosystem, map the touch points, like, you mentioned value streams earlier, like understand how value gets delivered and what those steps are along the way. But again, it's not something that people always take the time to just sit down and like have that common visual of what their ecosystem looks like.
Yeah, planning is work, diagramming is work, and you have to build it into your process and respect that what it does is it allows for better collaboration. I think often we try to overemphasize or overinvest in these artifacts when really when we're building an artifact, the experience that we get out of it is really what we should be investing in, not the final product itself.
Yeah. I think with that, there's this word empowerment. It's very popular right now. And you and I both have thoughts on it. And you talked about decision-making authority and strategic intent earlier, and I'm staring at Rethinking at Agile by Klaus Leopold over here, which you recommended to me, and then Josh stole the book off my desk and brought it to the podcast library. But talk about your view of empowerment and like how you think about that in terms of the cultural aspects of it, in terms of the delivery aspects of it, and just like wrestling with setting it up. I think was one of the hardest things. Like, what have you seen there?
Yeah. So there are anti-patterns that come with empowerment. And I think we've talked about it before. Same thing, I relate it with autonomy. If you're not giving good direction or strategic direction of around what we're doing, then empowerment almost is doesn't help anybody out. Saying, hey, you can go do whatever you want. Well, where do I start? And so I think empowering someone it requires work on you as well. And if you're going to be empowered, it's you don't do it in a silo. You do it with other people, and so it should be a team event when you're working within teams. So we say, hey, what are we going to do? But more specifically, what are we not going to do? That allows us to stay focused on what we want to deliver.
I equate the word empowerment to, hey, I want to go play in the sand. And there's a difference between going to the beach and playing in a sandbox a little bit. And I think people view empowerment as this binary thing of we're either empowered or we're not. When really people are asking, if you look at flow theory, which is this concept of like how difficult is the task compared to your abilities, and we get in a flow state when the difficulty of the task slightly stretches our abilities, versus if the task is really difficult and we don't have the abilities, we get frustrated, versus if it's too easy and we have more abilities than that, we get checked out. And so I think that's the balancing act for organizations is how do I enable people to grow in a meaningful way and give them tasks that they have the ability to influence, they have the most information to make that decision. And going all the way back to strategy and discovery, there are a lot of decisions where you want the people who have context and you have the knowledge who are closest to the user to be able to make those final decisions. And so that's probably one of the biggest anti-patterns culture that it's easy to find is if every decision about UX and you have very senior executives, finalizing every feature, or you have these onerous approval processes, you're probably not empowering people enough. But then on the other side, if you have teams that end up in decision purgatory, or they're getting into like heavy disagreements all the time, like they're probably, I don't want to say over empowered, but you're probably lacking that strategic intent because you clearly haven't outlined the guiding principles that people are gonna drive around to do that. And so, empowerment, it's hard to separate empowerment from accountability and measurement, and trust, I think, is really important in the organizations. Like that's one of the things that's hardest for organizations is they don't trust that people are going to drive to the outcomes. And that's why they kind of continue to insert too much leadership into every decision. But, I think that's one of the things when you think about retaining talent in this ecosystem of giving people that proper empowerment without asking them to do too much, but then not having them get disengaged because they feel like they're just checking a box is really important.
Yeah, and I'm hearing, if I'm hearing you correctly, like what we're talking about in part with the empowerment conversation is you can't properly empower people without the strategy, but there's got to be guardrails so they know within, like, what are the confines in which I can be empowered, because you're not empowering anybody if they don't know, to your point, like if they don't know where they're marching towards, then you're actually cutting their legs out from under them.
Yeah.
It's like, here, you go make all the right decisions, but if you don't know what you're marching towards, it's like you're just setting them up for failure.
Yeah, and you use the term failure, which is an interesting one, and I think I don't know your thoughts on this, but fail fast is actually one of my least favorite sayings when it comes to Agile. And so I really prefer the term calculated mistakes instead of fail fast, because if you have this system set up, especially in an enterprise, like most enterprises like aren't always launching completely new ventures that can fail. Like failure is we missed our goal by a little bit or like hit it. It's a lot of the like incremental changes. And so really leadership with their strategy, with the principles they're passing down, they should set a floor for this is, like, hey, based on what we've told you, it's not going to be any worse than this because we've set that baseline. We've done enough research. We feel confident enough. And so what you're giving teams the ability to do is it's kind of this servant leader mentality of, hey, this is the floor. We've set the constraints. Like, show us what you got. Like, take us a little bit farther. Like, we've set up the problem for you. We've set the target of what we want to achieve. You're close to the users. You're a talented person. Like, what resources do you need to be able to achieve or overachieve this goal potentially? And so creating an environment where you can make a calculated mistake because you want to learn something or you want to try something and you're going to reach those goals over time. Like, really, if you're doing this right, you never have a huge failure. Now, if you're at a startup or something different, you're reaching product market fit, that's different. But it's a lot of these minor tweaks. And I forget where I read it, but someone once said, product management is really just making sure every release is a little less worse than the last one. And we're just making a series of trade-off decisions and getting a little bit better. Like that's kind of what the job is.
Yeah.
And empowering people to do that as leaders is really important because otherwise it doesn't scale. And you just end up kind of creating this series of bottlenecks and you kind of leave people feeling disengaged.
I think we're coming to a close here in this conversation, but before we do, what action steps can we give our listeners to take on, what we've talked about here today?
Yeah, I think for me, when it comes to delivery, I think two important self-reflection moments people can have. I think one is, where does delivery end for us? Does it end when we release, or does it end when we succeed in doing what we set out to do? And how much of our attention are we spending on making sure what we did worked and revisiting it? I think the second thing is, do you have a sense where your bottlenecks are? And I liked what David said around like which ones are good and which ones are bad. The experiment I always think about is, hey, we inject $1 million into your organization tomorrow, and you have to launch this new innovative product or a new innovative feature in your product. Where would the money stop? Like, where would it get jammed up and like get slowed down? Is it, hey, we're not going to be able to align on what to do? Is it like, hey, we don't have like great requirements because the architecture and design and product aren't aligned? Is it going to get stuck in testing, or like, hey, our releases are long because we don't have DevOps? Like, just have a sense of like, where is work getting stuck today? And I think that's a really powerful set of questions to understand. And then culturally, I think as a leader, are teams making the right decisions at the right levels, and what can you do to serve them better if they're not empowered? I think, sometimes I see teams saying, hey, we're going to empower people by asking them to do more strategy. And we're going to take people that are used to being BAs and we're going to ask them to overnight start being product managers and doing more strategic decision making. That stuff takes time. Like, do people have the time to do the things they need to make empowered or not? And do they have that clear vision? So, I don't know, David, I'd be curious your thoughts. What are some things people can go do?
Yeah, I think things that are actionable is, take inventory and maybe even audit yourselves on all the things that you are delivering. Does it make sense? Have you maybe lost what the intention was when you had started that thing, and say what needs to be true to either push it over into sustainment or operations or stop it where it is today. I like what you said earlier about ask your hows down and your whys up to make sure it's still aligned to the strategy. And I think maybe building in a regular audit into your cycle is very helpful to do, just to at least as anything else, if you don't change anything, your leadership teams or your delivery teams are aware, like, yep, we're doing the things that we need to be doing. And I think the next thing I think about is actually mapping out and tracking the decisions that are made. Doing that will maybe generate some insights of like, are they being made at the right level? And kind of going to your point around empowerment, should we push some of these decisions down? Is that group or those people or those leaders at that level ready for this? And if not, how do we get them ready for it? Too often, leaders are promoted and incentivized to keep being individual contributors at a higher level. And what are you intentionally doing inside your organization to move either their performance views less around what they did and more around what their teams are doing and how that's aligned to the strategy? I think is any company can spend some more time there.
A plus one to that, I think keeping that decision log in a very blameless way.
Yeah.
It's a reflection. It's a feedback loop. It's not, you're not keeping receipts.
Right.
It's not.
Let's consult the record.
It's
You
meant
made
to do
this
that.
decision.
And I think equally important, especially, as we look at data, is not just the decisions on what you chose to do, but the decisions of what you chose not to do.
100%.
There's a great book I just read called The Crux that talks about strategy. And they use the term action alternatives. And so for every strategy, there is a series of alternatives that could have been taken. And so I think looking at what did we do and what did we choose not to do, and potentially coming back to what we chose not to do is one of these alternatives better in the future? Like keeping that log, aligning the team around that too, because I guarantee you, if you don't have that documented, you're going to get towards production and somebody will be like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And it's like, well, here's why we chose not to do that. And again, it probably goes back to empowerment of, helping people understand why we've chosen the strategy, the action alternatives considered, like keeping that decision history, that knowledge, like helps set those teams up for success. So they understand, again, those guardrails they're working within.
Well, I think that's a great place for us to wrap the conversation. I think we've provided a lot of content here. I think our listeners, hopefully, got a lot out of this, and there will be more to come. So make sure that you stay tuned for future episodes, and I'm sure we'll have you two back as we move forward. But thank you for your time. Thank you for all the time and effort you put into this content and sharing it with us. So it's been great to
Thank you both.
Thank you for joining us on Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. If you would like to know more about how Method can partner with you and your organization, you can find more information at method.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on social and be sure to check out our monthly Tech Talks. You can find those on our website. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We'll see you next time.